The moon hung high in the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the college campus. It was the night of the full moon again, and Jenna couldn't shake the feeling of uneasiness that crept over her as she sat on her bed. Glancing at the clock, her roommate Alex had been acting strange lately, vanishing every full moon, returning with scars left deeply into his skin. "Hey, you're going to be late," Jenna called out, watching as Alex shoved clothes into his backpack. "I'll be fine. Just a night out," he replied, avoiding her gaze. His voice was tense, almost strained, and the ripped sleeves of his shirt only added to Jenna's growing worry. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" she asked, but Alex shook his head, his eyes darting to the window as if something outside was calling him. "Really? I'll be back before morning," he said, forcing a smile that didn't really reach his eyes. He slipped a strange, creepy necklace over his head, a tarnished silver piece shaped like a crescent moon. Jenna shivered. It felt wrong, like a talisman meant to keep something at bay. As the door closed behind him, Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. She spent the next few hours trying to distract herself, but the clock ticked slowly, each second echoing in the silence. When midnight struck, she decided to do something unthinkable. She would follow Alex. Grabbing her jacket, Jenna quietly slipped out of the dorm and made her way through the shadowy campus as she approached the woods behind the college. A feeling of dread settled in her stomach. She could hear the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But she pressed on, guided by the glow of the full moon. After a few minutes, she stumbled upon a hidden cabin, its dark windows watching her like eyes in the night. Jenna's heart raced. She felt drawn to it, as if something inside was calling her name. She crept closer, the creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet echoing like a warning. Pushing the door open, she was hit by a wave of stale air. Inside the cabin was dimly lit by flickering candles, but it wasn't the candles that made her blood run cold. It was the sight that greeted her. Ripped clothes littered the floor, and in the corner, Jenna's breath caught in her throat. There, hanging from a hook, were several filthy garments that looked all too familiar. Alex's clothes. Her heart pounded as she stepped further into the room, the floorboards creaking. Suddenly she noticed something in the shadows, a glimpse of movement. She squatted into the dark and gasped. A pair of rotting hands reached out from behind the grate, fingers curling as if trying to grasp something. Jenna stumbled back, nearly tripping over a pile of broken furniture. "Alex," she called, her voice trembling. The only reply was the soft whisper of the wind through the cracks in the walls. Then she heard it, a low growl from the darkness. Jenna's instinct kicked in, and she turned to run, but as she reached the door, it swung shut on its own. Panic surged through her veins. In the reflection of a cracked mirror, she caught sight of a figure lurking in the shadows behind her. It was Alex, his face pale and marked with fresh scars. The necklace glistened around his neck. "Jenna," he shouted, his voice strained. "You shouldn't be here." "What's going on? What are those hands?" she cried, terror tightening her chest. "They're not what you think," he yelled, but before he could explain, a monstrous growl echoed from the back of the cabin, and the hands began to move, crawling at the ground as if trying to escape their prison. In that moment, Jenna felt a surge of dread as she realized the truth. Alex was connected to whatever dark force haunted this place. As he reached for her, she saw the truth in his eyes. He was no longer the friend she knew. "Run, Jenna, please," he begged. Without thinking, she bolted for the door, yanking it open just as the growling intensified. She ran into the night, her heart pounding in her chest, and didn't stop until she reached the safety of her dorm room. Jenna collapsed on her bed, gasping for breath. The moonlight flooded her room, but it felt tainted, as if the night itself was alive with secrets. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever darkness had claimed Alex was still out there, waiting for its next victim. As she stared out into the moonlit night, she knew she couldn't go back to sleep. The full moon had revealed too much, and the secrets of the night would forever haunt her dreams. Becky had always felt a little uneasy about the neighbor, Larry. The guy who lived in the run-down house directly across the street. He never said much, always kept to himself, but something about him gave her chills. The way he stared too long when she passed by. The way his blinds were always half open, as if he was constantly watching. For weeks, the women in the neighborhood had whispered about strange things happening in their homes. Satanic idols left behind, things being moved around. One woman claimed she woke up to find a figurine on her pillow. No one knew who was responsible, but Becky had a gut feeling it had to be Larry. One night, as the rain poured down outside, Becky woke up with a strange feeling, her skin tingling with dread. The room was dark, except for a faint glow of her bedside clock, 2:47 a.m. She rolled over, her heart stopping in her chest, when she saw a figure standing next to her bed. It was Larry. He stood there, his face inches away from hers, breathing heavily. His eyes were wide, staring right at her, not saying a word. Panic surged through Becky. She didn't know how he had gotten in, but she didn't have time to think. She needed to get out. Her instincts kicked in. She screamed, launching herself off the bed, pushing past him as she darted for the door. Larry stumbled, but reached for her, his breath ragged and fast as he grabbed the hem of her skirt, trying to pull her back. Becky twisted away, yanking herself free and bolting down the hallway. She reached the kitchen, grabbing her phone from the counter, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. "Help! There's a man in my house. He broke in," she shouted into the phone, her voice shaking. The operator assured her that the police were on their way, but as she turned to glance back down the hallway, she saw Larry standing there, just outside her bedroom door, watching her with those same wide, empty eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out through the front door like nothing had happened. Becky stood there, frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't long before the police arrived, rushing inside and surrounding her house. The officers quickly spread out, searching the area. Moments later, they found Larry outside, wandering around his yard, like he was completely unaware of what he had just done. He didn't resist. They cuffed him and took him away. But that wasn't the end of it. The police decided to search Larry's house after Becky told them everything. What they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. Inside his basement, Hidden behind layers of old boxes and shelves was a dark room. The walls were covered with pictures of women from the neighborhood, pictures taken through windows from across the street and even up close while they slept. Becky saw her own face in several of the photos, along with faces of her neighbors. That wasn't all. Scattered across tables and shelves were satanic idols, dozens of them. Some were small, made of bone and metal, while others were grotesque, almost lifelike. It was clear that Larry hadn't just been watching. He'd been breaking into their homes, leaving behind these twisted offerings for reasons no one could understand. But then the officers found something far worse. In the darkest corner of the basement, behind a large curtain, was a row of shelves. On those shelves, human heads sat, preserved in jars, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The discovery left the police horrified. Larry hadn't just been stalking. He was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Becky could hardly breathe when she heard about the heads. How close had she come to being one of his victims? That night, as the police took Larry away, his eyes met Becky's one last time, even as they shoved him into the squad car. He smiled at her, a smile that sent a chill down her spine. She would never forget those eyes, the eyes that had been watching her and everyone else across the street for far too long. It was a typical Friday night when Jake and Mia moved into their new apartment. The building had seen better days before, but it was affordable, and they were eager to start their life together. However, it didn't take long for them to notice their neighbor, Mr. Collins. At first, it was just strange noises. Late at night, they could hear muffled shouting and what sounded like furniture being thrown around. Mia brushed it off as typical new neighbor quirks, but Jake felt uneasy. One night, while taking out the trash, Jake spotted Mr. Collins in the dim light of the hallway. He was disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes. His skin looked pale and clammy, and he stared at Jake for a moment too long. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. Just a rough night, Jake thought, trying to shake off the feeling. But the next few nights, the noises got worse. There were no longer just random thumps. They sounded like someone was begging for help, or worse, screaming in terror. "I think we should check on him," Mia suggested one evening. "What if he's in trouble?" Jake hesitated, but eventually agreed. They knocked on Mr. Collins' door, but there was no answer. After a few moments, Mia whispered, "Let's just leave him alone." But the following night, the screams echoed again, louder this time. Jake's curiosity got the better of him. "I can't just ignore this," he said, heading down the hall. Mia followed carefully. They knocked again, and this time they heard a faint voice. "Help me, please." Heart racing, Jake pushed the door open. The room was dark and filled with an overwhelming stench of mildew and something else, something rotten. "Mr. Collins," Mia called out, but the voice came from a corner, barely illuminated by a flickering bulb. To their horror, they saw Mr. Collins curled up on the floor, his eyes wide and frantic. "You shouldn't have come," he gasped, shaking wildly. "They're coming for me." "Who's coming?" Jake asked, inching closer. Mr. Collins' trembling finger pointed toward the shadows. "The ones in the dark. They're always watching me. They want my soul." Suddenly the shadows shifted, swirling around the room like a living thing. Jake and Mia felt an icy chill as a low growl echoed through the apartment. Panic surged as they realized Mr. Collins wasn't just an attic. He was a vessel for something dark and sinister. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Mia's hand. They bolted down the stairs, but the shadows followed, creeping closer with each step. Once outside, they gasped for breath, adrenaline pumping. The screams from Mr. Collins faded, but the darkness lingered. "What was that?" Mia panted, glancing back at the building. "I don't know," Jake replied, his heart racing, "but we can't stay here." They hurried to their car, and as they drove away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Days passed, and they tried to forget about Mr. Collins and the horrors of that night. But every night, they heard whispers in the dark, shadows floating past their windows, and the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. One evening, as they sat on the couch, the power went out. The room was purged into darkness, and a cold breeze swept through the apartment. They huddled together, fear gripping them. "Jake, do you feel that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows thickened, and the temperature dropped even lower. A figure emerged from the darkness. Mr. Collins, eyes wide and hollow, his voice a mere whisper. "You can't escape. They've chosen you." As the shadows engulfed the room, Jake and Mia realized the truth. Addiction had opened a doorway to something far more terrifying than they could ever imagine. In that moment, they understood that some neighbors hold secrets that can consume your very soul. And the darkness was only just the beginning. It was a cold, rainy Halloween night, and kids in costumes were running up and down the street, laughing and shouting as they trick-or-treated. The rain didn't bother them. The street lights flickered on, lighting up the puddles in the road, and the wind howled through the trees. Most houses were decorated with pumpkins and spooky decorations, but one house stood out. Mr. Grady's house at the very end of the block. Nobody knew much about Mr. Grady. He was an odd man, always keeping to himself. He never handed out candy, never joined in the neighborhood block parties. People said he was antisocial. But Sarah, a 16-year-old who lived across the street, thought it was more than that. There were rumors about Mr. Grady, rumors about strange visitors coming to his house late at night. Sarah had noticed it too, weird cars pulling up at odd hours, the sound of low voices and doors closing softly in the middle of the night. But tonight, something seemed different. Sarah was home alone watching TV and occasionally glancing out the window at the groups of kids running by. Her parents were at a party and wouldn't be home until later. At around 10:50 p.m., Sarah saw something that made her freeze. There across the street was Mr. Grady, dragging two massive black trash bags toward his front door. He struggled with the weight, pausing now and then to catch his breath. The bags were huge, bulky, and soaked from the rain, making them look even more suspicious. Sarah leaned closer to the window, her heart thudding in her chest. What could be in those bags? Old furniture? But as she watched, one of the bags ripped open slightly, and something slid out. A hand, pale, limp, and unmistakably human. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. Did she just see what she thought she saw? Was it a Halloween decoration? No, it looked too real, too terrifyingly real. Before she could move, she saw something even worse. Mr. Grady looked up straight at her window. Their eyes met, and for a long, horrifying moment, they just stared at each other. He knew she had seen the hand. Panic surged through her. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and immediately called her parents. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. She left a voicemail, her voice barely steady, telling them to come home right away. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on her front door. "Open the door, Sarah." Mr. Grady's voice was deep and cold, muffled by the rain, but angry. He banged on the door again, harder this time. The door rattled under the force. "I know you're in there. Let me in." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might explode. She backed away from the door, clutching her phone tightly. She didn't know what to do. She dialed her parents again, but still no answer. The rain outside grew louder, pounding against the windows, and the sound of Mr. Grady's fists hitting the door was getting more louder. "Open up. You weren't supposed to see that." His voice was sharper now, almost frantic. Sarah looked around, trying to think of a plan. Could she run? Hide? The door wouldn't hold much longer, and she could hear his footsteps pacing outside. Then the headlights of a car cut through the darkness. Her parents' car pulling into the driveway. As soon as Mr. Grady saw the lights, he stopped banging. Without a word, he turned and ran, disappearing into the rainy night. Her parents rushed inside, soaked and confused, as Sarah frantically tried to explain what she had seen. They didn't believe her at first. After all, it was Halloween, and her story sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. But when they went outside, they saw it. A single black trash bag abandoned on Mr. Grady's front porch. The bag was torn open, but whatever had fallen out was gone. That night, they called the police, but when they arrived, Mr. Grady's house was empty. He was gone. From that night on, Mr. Grady never came back. His house stayed dark and empty, but Sarah never forgot the sight of that hand falling out of the bag. And she always wondered what would have happened if he had made it through her door.